As we know, language is everything. We've all seen those headlines, such as jealous gardener admits crime of passion after killing lover, or husband kills in-laws and stabs daughter after wife asks him for divorce. But recently, Britain's two media regulators have issued new guidelines on how journalists should report on fatal domestic abuse. It's all thanks to the work of Level Up, a UK feminist organisation working to end sexism, who push for the guidelines to be implemented. Joining me now from London is Janey Starling, a campaign manager for the organisation. Janey, thanks for your time. Language, as I say, is a very powerful tool in shaping cultural attitudes, isn't it? And when you see the media coverage of such cases, it always seems to be from the male perspective.
What's terrifying, actually, so in the UK, 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner. And what's scary is the way it's reported in newspapers is often romanticised. So you'll hear stories about jealous husbands, jilted lovers, spurned exes, when in reality there's nothing romantic or loving about murder. And the way that the UK press has so far been reporting domestic homicide is completely unacceptable. It does tend to blame victims. There is a stock headline that we see wheeled out time and time again, which says, you know, romantic cliche, so jealous husband kills partner after, and then they will reference her behaviour. So what these guidelines aim to call for is for journalists just to look deeper into the context and the character of the relationship and look at the patterns of control that lead up to a homicide, because that is the most useful thing that we can be distributing among ourselves in the public to stop more women dying.
So how does the media coverage impact the way that society views domestic violence?
So I do think that when we're, talking about domestic violence, we tend to think of it as something extreme, something that happens behind closed doors, when actually 1 in 4 women in the UK will experience it in their lifetimes. It's all around us. So the news coverage of these cases is essential in helping us identify what risk factors are. So, for example, we might see a couple that we know who are always together, they're inseparable. In fact, that's not healthy. That's not a healthy relationship. That could be a dynamic of control and isolation, because the best way to isolate someone is by always being with them. So ultimately, when we read about these cases, instead of seeing them as, someone's just lost control and he loved her so much that he killed her, looking into the slow build-up, as referenced in the case of Clemence, who just bravely spoke, and look at how these patterns of behaviour escalate to a homicide, because domestic violence murders do not come out of the blue. They are usually the endpoint to a sustained period of coercive control, and that's what we need to be drilling into.
So take me through what these guidelines actually recommend.
So the guidelines are an extensive document. They are available online. But in essence, what we're calling for is just dignity for dead women. So one of the first things that journalists need to do is to hold men accountable for their actions, not referencing a woman's behaviour in the lead up to a murder, but talking about how a man has chosen to kill his ex-partner as a final act of control. Second is referencing the crime as domestic violence, and not just a freak accident or incident that came out of the blue, but looking at the patterns of control and coercive behaviour, and also saying, if you recognise any of these behaviours, please call this helpline below, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline. And then more broadly, what the guidelines references are just checkpoints for journalists to think, okay, am I actually digging into this? Am I covering the nuance? Am I managing to get useful information, or am I just knocking on a neighbour's door and the neighbour tells me he's a lovely guy, so I'm going to add that into the piece?
Are media outlets by law, as a result, compelled to follow these guidelines?
So because the UK, we obviously have the freedom of the press, it's not controlled by law, but there are editorial standards, and these guidelines are there to support journalists to do the right thing. And what's been really brilliant about this campaign is how much positive engagement we've had from journalists, from all publications, from press, broadcast, radio. It's been really fantastic, and it just seems like this is a resource that people want and they are finding useful.
Well, you're saying there that, you're finding journalists are open to such directives, but in many cases it's not just the reporters on the ground, but it's also the newsroom directors, the management of media organisations who can be just at fault.
I think what's really interesting about this issue in particular is that it's systemic. It happens across all publications, different platforms. There's no single one. So it does seem like by drawing a moral standard now and saying these guidelines are out there, this is what victims' families are calling for, this is what domestic homicide prevention experts are calling for, we've now set a new standard, and anyone who falls short of that is choosing to. And also, it sounds so simple, but just putting the picture of the woman who's been killed at the top of the article instead of the mugshot of the man who has murdered her, because this is something that families find very distressing and is a really super simple change that editors can make and are starting to make.